Welcome to episode 1 of The Citizen Linguist. I'm Kevin Borland, and today let's talk about eggs. Specifically, we're going to explore the etymology of the English word egg and whether or not knowledge of such things can help us learn anything interesting about our most distant proven linguistic ancestor, the Proto-Indo-European language. In this first quote from William Caxton's Aeneas, we find an anecdote discussing the terms for eggs used in Middle English. And I'm going to look over here because that's where my teleprompter is so I could read the passage. And that common English that is spoken in one shire varieth from another, in so much that in me days happened that certain merchants were in a ship in Thames for to have sailed over the sea into Zealand, and for lack of wind they tarried at the foreland and went to land for to refresh them. And one of them, named Sheffield, a mercer, came into a house and asked for mate, and specially he asked after eggs. And the good wife answered that she could speak no French. And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak no French, but would have had eggs, and she understood him not. And then at last another said that he would have Erin. Then the good wife said that she understood him well. Lo, what should a man in these days now read? Eggs or Erin? Certainly, it is hard to please every man because of diversity and change of language. And that is from William Caxton in the year 1490 was relaying that. So this passage clearly illustrates that Middle English had two words for eggs, one being egg, the direct ancestor of the modern English word, and the other being a, the singular form of Erin, understood by the good wife, which is the Middle English version of the word passed down from Old English. While the good wife misunderstood egg, or the good woman, for French vocabulary, and in fact was a loan from Old Norse. During the 9th and 11th centuries, Norse-speaking Vikings from present-day Denmark and Norway settled in northern and eastern England. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, about 886, formalized the Danelaw, an area where Norse law and culture had significant influence. Over time, Old Norse and Old English speakers coexisted, leading to mutual borrowing of words. Unlike Latin loanwords, which were often entered English through writing and formal learning, Norse loanwords were absorbed through everyday spoken interaction. This resulted in a more organic blending of the two languages, particularly in regions where Norse settlements were strongest. The impact of Old Norse on the English language extended far beyond the word for egg, of course, and during this era in English history, we also borrowed some of the very basic vocabulary, including words sky, window, and knife. Old English and Old Norse are closely related languages, and despite the borrowing of the egg word, both terms ultimately come from the same source, that being the Proto-Germanic language. Some modern descendants of the reconstructed Proto-Germanic word aya are displayed on this chart. And you can see that the Icelandic, Faroese, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, and English words look very similar, all of them looking kind of like the modern English word egg. However, the Frisian, Dutch, Low German, German, Yiddish versions look a lot more like the Goede wife as a. And you could see that that's very strong evidence that there was a borrowing from the Norse variant of the word, which ultimately came from the same origin. The evolution from the common Proto-Germanic ancestor of both egg and a can be described by a series of linguistic transactions or operations, each of which occurred in either the Norse or the English branch, or both. Some of those operations in the path from the Proto-Germanic form aia to the Old English form a included the loss of unstressed final vowel and the palatalization of the y consonant. Then from Old English to Middle English, the raising of the vowel sound and diphthongization in the transition from egg to a to a. These patterns of sound changes were systematic and affected many English words in similar fashion as the English language evolved. Then, the next operation observed as we passed from the native Middle English form to the modern English egg was of a different character, a replacement with a borrowed word from Old Norse. This operation was also systematic in that the replacement of native English vocabulary with Old Norse terms occurred in mass, due to significant contact over a long period of time between the speakers of Old Norse and Middle English. A different set of systematic operators acting upon Proto-Germanic ayak could be demonstrated, which lead to each and every one of the forms in the descendant languages shown in the previous chart. If we step back further in time to Proto-Indo-European, we find that many other descendant branches in the language family also have a related word for egg, which has allowed linguists to reconstruct a hypothetical Proto-Indo-European word, oyo. Some examples of cognate words for egg in both ancient and the modern languages are depicted in the chart, where the first column indicates the branch of the Indo-European language family. Anatolian languages, such as Hittite and the Tocharian languages, are poorly attested, and therefore not enough data exists to determine whether there was a cognate word for egg in those branches. We have simply no text discussing eggs in these extinct languages, basically. However, the absence of our egg word in well-attested branches such as Armenian, Albanian, and especially Indo-Iranian, a branch that contains Sanskrit, an ancient language, as well as approximately 300 living languages, is perhaps important evidence in our quest to understand the phylogenetic structure of the Indo-European language family. While we're on the current slide, let's talk about the general stability of the word egg. That is, in 5 of the descendant language branches, we have many examples of our egg word being passed down without replacement borrowing operations. English being one of those notable exceptions because we actually borrowed the term from Old Norse. Relatively speaking, the linguistic concept of an egg appears to be pretty stable across very long periods of time and not particularly susceptible to replacement, absent long periods of significant contact between speakers of another language. What we're looking at here is a model for the internal clade structure of the Indo-European language family from a 2020 paper by David Goldstein. For our present discussion, I'm going to ignore the Anatolian and Tocharian branches and instead focus on the other branches in the diagram for which we actually have data regarding the egg word. Ignoring the placement of Anatolian and Tocharian, the diagram suggests that a major split in the Indo-European family led to the formation of a single phylogenetic clade that subsequently had internal linguistic evolution operations, resulting in the formation of the Balto-Slavic, Germanic, and Celtic and Italic subfamilies. How does our study of the egg word fit into this paradigm? The data almost fits a hypothesis that our Proto-Indo-European oyo is rather the result of an innovation operation specific to only one side of the split, that being the clade that subsequently formed into the Balto-Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, and Italic languages. After all, this would save us any need to hypothesize replacement operations in Albanian and Armenian branches, as well as very early on in the Indo-Iranian branch, which may kind of get us into an Occam's razor territory, where we're introducing unnecessary assumptions to maintain a preconceived idea. However, there's a pesky outlier, and that specifically is the ancient Greek, which is on the other side of the split, which had a well-attested cognate for our egg word, indicating that the innovation operator that spawned oyo occurred prior to the split of the Greco-Hellenic subclade from the megaclade that we just referred to, the one that formed the Balto-Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, and Italic subfamilies. However, I'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the alternatives. So let's start with alternative 1 here. The Hellenic branch is misplaced on the clade diagram and belongs on the other side of the split. With regard to this explanation, I have not personally studied ancient Greek or Armenian, but I believe there is significant support in the linguistic community for the Greco-Armenian hypothesis, which is based on many more data points from the linguistic signatures of these languages than just the presence of a common word for egg. Therefore, if we were to propose an internal reconstruction of the Indo-European family, it would make sense to move the entire Greco-Armenian clade rather than just the Hellenic branch by itself, which gets us to our second alternative. Alternative 2 is the Greco-Armenian is a distinct branch, but belongs on the other side of the split. So it's just kind of moving the goalpost a bit. And this would be consistent with hypotheses that the Indo-Iranian and Albanian branches split from the Greco-Armenian branch before the innovation occurred that created the word oyo for egg. I think this is entirely possible, And we'll explore whether we have any other clues based on our egg study that would support this, uh, as opposed to the hypothesis that Oyo for egg is truly Indo-European in nature and spans the entire family. Um, Alternative three, of course, is that a replacement operation occurred specifically that affected ancient Greek. A replacement operation occurred prior to ancient Greek when the Hellenic family borrowed an early form of Oyo from a neighboring language on the other side of the split, from one of those other languages in our mega family. And there we have an ancient Greek and an ancient Roman sharing some eggs. How nice. However, in real life, the contact between the Romans and the Greeks took place much too recently and would probably not have explained the borrowing from Italic branch into Greek prior to the attested ancient Greek texts. Specifically, we have evidence of Greek word oion appearing as early as Homeric Greek from Homer, which is traditionally dated to around the 8th century BC in works like the Iliad and the Odyssey. The word is also well attested in classical Greek, 5th to 4th centuries BC, appearing in the medical texts like those of Hippocrates from about 460 to 370 BC, and in Aristotle's Historia Animalium, 4th century BC, where he discusses the structure of eggs in birds, thankfully. By contrast, the meaningful Roman-Greek contact that could have led to large-scale lexical borrowing began in earnest only around the 3rd century BC, particularly after the Roman conquest of Magna Graecia, which was like 280 to 272 BC, and later the conquest of Greece in 146 BC. By this time, Greek already had a well-established and ancient form of the word egg, making it highly unlikely that the term was borrowed from Latin ovum into Greek at this late stage. Moreover, we have strong linguistic evidence that Greek evolved its form from the egg word independently from Italic rather than borrowing it. One key indicator is that Greek retained features that are more archaic when compared to the Latin form. The presence of the diphthong, which reflects an earlier Indo-European vocalic pattern that was later simplified in Latin to ovum. The preservation of the diphthong suggests that Greek inherited the term from a much older source rather than borrowing the later simplified version from Latin. The presence of the yod, the ya, in Proto-Indo-European reconstructions, which aligns well with the Greek oion, but was completely lost in the Latin ovum. If Greek had borrowed the word from Latin, we would expect it to resemble ovum much more closely rather than retaining its conservative features. The phonological evolution of the root in Greek aligns with the internal Greek sound laws rather than the Latin or Italic phonetic developments. The Greek form traces back to Proto-Hellenic, which means that it was inherited directly from an earlier common ancestor, rather than transferred from another branch of Indo-European. Now let's turn our attention to Armenian. If we assume that the Proto-Indo-European word for egg, oyo, was indeed an innovation that post-dated the initial Proto-Indo-European split that we referred to before in the clay diagram, that we must ask, is it plausible that a replacement operation occurred in the Armenian branch? Armenian presents a challenge because unlike Greek and Latin, its earliest attested form, classical Armenian, does not retain a reflex of oyo. Instead, the earliest Armenian word for egg that we know of appears to be dzu, which bears no obvious resemblance to its Indo-European cognates. So let's take a look at a couple possibilities. First possibility is that a replacement occurred whereby the Armenian language adopted a word for egg from a neighboring population. Armenian underwent significant influence from neighboring languages, including Iranian, and possibly Semitic languages. If the Armenian-speaking population came into prolonged contact with a region where a non-Indo-European word for egg was dominant, they may have adopted it, gradually displacing the inherited Proto-Indo-European form, perhaps through commerce. Another possibility to explore is one of internal replacement, potentially due to taboo. So what I'm saying here is that words related to reproduction, body parts, death, things like that, or other culturally sensitive topics are often subject to taboo-driven lexical replacement from within the language as opposed to from an outside source. If in Armenian culture the lexical connotation of the underlying word concept, of the underlying concept of an egg, had shifted slightly in the direction of cultural association with human reproduction or fertility, for example, it's possible that the older Proto-Indo-European term existed in that branch, but then was replaced from within to avoid taboo, and when talking about eggs in ordinary speech. And that being said, the etymology of, or the source of zoo is, to my knowledge, not presently understood. While the concept of an egg appears to be lexically stable, I think the evidence nonetheless supports that the proposition that one way or another a replacement from an unknown source for reasons not fully known did occur in Armenian with respect to the Proto-Indo-European egg word, and most likely, the Greco-Armenian hypothesis is probably accurate. As we expand our discussion into the realm of the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European, let's address the very nature of the proposed innovation operator that resulted in our original OYO egg word, which I believe gets us into the age-old question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. When considering the etymology of egg, one of the first thoughts that came to my mind was the similarity of OYO to words in English that related to birds and flight, such as aviation, aviary, which contain italic loanwords for roots related to Latin avis, bird. This is probably a good time to also note that the English language has borrowed from Latin forms of ovio for certain terms related to eggs, such as ovals, which is geometric shapes that resemble an egg, and certain medical and scientific terms. But for this slide, I'm talking about words that specifically relate to birds and flight. They're also borrowings, because obviously bird in English is not related to ovio, the term itself. They don't sound anything alike. But back to the chicken and the egg problem. Could ovio, a bird product, simply be an inflection of the Proto-Indo-European word avi for bird, which is the source of the Latin bird and flight related loanwords in English? If this were to be possible, if the bird came before the egg, then by logical necessity, the term awi would have to be at least as old as the word ovio for egg. The answer to this riddle may be in the Indo-Iranian language family. If the attested Sanskrit word vi and the attested Avestan word, it's from the Persian side of the Indo-Iranian word vish, both meaning bird, are cognate with Latin avis, then I think this strongly suggests that a Proto-Indo-European form awi extends at least as far into the history of Indo-European as the term ovio for egg, making this theory possible. Also, I should be careful here because it is quite possible that while we have thus far considered the notion that an ancient Indo-European culture, members of that civilization conceptualize an egg to be a bird product, to be that which comes from a bird, would be the inflection, almost like either a genitive or something like that form of bird. We also might just as well describe a bird as that which comes from an egg, because a bird comes from an egg. So in which case the word for egg might reasonably be expected to have predated the corresponding inflection ovio that came to mean bird. And I'm not sure that's really possible to rule out either possibility without investigating an exhaustive inventory of other similar operators from the same time period in Indo-European history and attempting to find a pattern that, a systematic pattern indicating a series of related operators across that period of language evolution in the Indo-European language family that explains a system for such translations, transactions, akin to the same sort of patterns we see when we look at other semantic parallel operators, such as the inflectional pattern that explains the differences in meanings in pairs such as swim, swam, and think, thank, and drink, drank, where a vowel changes and changes the meaning or the inflection of into a related word. One might, for example, um, see other individual operators that acted upon other nouns by changing the leading vowel in order to pass between that object expressed by the word and a product of that object. Whether the product is the egg or the chicken, that's a different story. But maybe we could figure that out if we explored enough operators from that time period that are acting the same way, that are changing a vowel at the beginning of Indo-European words in order to slightly change the meaning to maybe to a genitive case or something like that. This is a little bit beyond the scope of this video because most of what we're going to talk about here is about the egg words themselves. But this is a problem we'll keep in mind in the background minds when we explore other linguistic problems in future videos. And let's move on to the next directly egg issue here. Instead, let's move on to the topic of why there are so few branches of the Indo-European language family that have cognates to Latin avis for bird. For example, of course, English does not. Bird, it sounds absolutely nothing like avis and does not come from the same root for sure. Neither does ptitsa in Russian, for example. I believe the answer is that the somewhat nebulous linguistic concept of a bird makes it inherently prone to replacement in the process of language evolution. And much more so than compared to the linguistic concept of an egg. For example, in a certain society, perhaps songbirds were considered fundamentally different animals than chickens, based on that society's cultural interactions with songbirds versus chickens. Maybe perhaps thinking of one as pets or outdoor, nature, and thinking of the other as food or source of eggs. And as there was no overlapping meaning between the two words in that civilization at the time, each word representing distinct concepts. However, over time, perhaps the cultural understanding of what it means to be a bird broadened, resulting in either the word for songbird or the word from chicken expanding, shifting to come to mean a broader term that encompasses both of those, both chickens and songbirds. And when that occurs, it's a shift in meaning. And when that occurs, there comes to be a linguistic need to adopt a new word for the old one that you shifted away from as a means of contrast, usually. So if the word for chicken becomes used instead to describe all birds, then the language would need a new term that refers to only chickens because you have to have a way to talk about chickens, right? So the gap would have to be filled by a linguistic operator of some sort, perhaps borrowing a word for chicken from a neighboring culture. It could be a loan word, especially if chickens are being traded in commerce or something. This might be the way that the word is replaced. Or perhaps by calling them something like walkers to contrast to what the chicken now means. It means every bird. Then you call what actually used to be a chicken, you call it a walker because unlike our word for every birds, we're referring to only birds that walk instead of fly. Or it may be a totally internal creativity thing where instead you replace it with like an onomatopoeia. You create a word, the culture creates a word that mimics the sound specifically of a chicken to distinguish it from our broader category of birds. Since bird terms have such a wide variety of literal and cultural significances that change over time and from society to society, they're very different. I would expect to see high volatility and frequent replacements in such terms as compared to a more stable linguistic concept, such as the one upon which our egg word is based. So actually, eggs are far more stable than birds. Humpty Dumpty proudly boasts there. So just to summarize, there are some factors we've already discussed in this video that cause instability, or in the context of lexical operators, an inherently higher susceptibility to replacement. The first one we discussed was nebulous subject matter, such as broad words that seek to classify groups of animals like bird. The second factor we discussed was relation to commerce. And this was in the good wife. discussion. Terms related to commerce are necessarily the subject of cross-cultural communication, and therefore prone to standardization between the cultures for the sake of commerce, for the sake of being able to trade with one another efficiently. Often by both cultures, both interacting civilizations adopting one of the culture's terms over the other being replaced. The third one we discussed is when a word needs to be replaced due to a taboo. And words related to certain human body parts, for example, may periodically become taboo and require replacement for ordinary conversation about such topics. A quick note on Albanian. The modern Albanian word for egg, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this because I've never personally studied our Albanian, is vizja. It is visually similar to the Avestan word vish for bird, indicating a potential relation, but no linguistic pathway from either oio or awi is obvious. After perusing through Juliet Blevin's recent publication, Advances in Proto-Basque Reconstruction with Evidence for the Proto-Indo-European Euskarian Hypothesis, I found no reference to any reconstructions on the Basque side to link either the Proto-Indo-European, Oyo, or Awi to Basque. Shifting to Uralic, which is the language of the Ural Mountain Samis and Finns and Estonians and Hungarians, for example, long been hypothesized to be closely related to Indo-European. We find that linguistics has established that the Proto-Uralic word for egg is muna. This form has widespread reflexes across the Uralic languages, including Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, and the Proto-Uralic reconstruction for bird is liksi, which also shows no obvious connection to our Proto-Indo-European roots. If these languages are genetically close to Proto-Indo-European, as is hypothesized by many, what might that mean with respect to our model for Proto-Indo-European etymologies we discussed? If the egg became before the bird, it might be more likely that we would have found a cognate in these potentially sister branches. I mean, we still may not have. I mean, the time frame may just be so long that that replacements happened, just like they did, for example, in the Sanskrit line, in the Indo-Iranian line for egg. Because of the higher degree of stability associated with the concept of an egg, you might expect to see something that looks a little bit like Oyo in Proto-Uralic or in Proto-Basque if we are to assume that the hypotheses are valid, that these are maybe our closest related language families. However, if the bird came before the egg, we shouldn't be surprised to see what we see at all, because the instability, the relative instability of the concept of a bird, we wouldn't really expect to see any cognates to obvious. We hardly see them within Indo-European, let alone to languages that may only be related several thousand more years back. So if those two languages and language families, I know Basque is an isolate, at least currently, if they are our closest relatives to Indo-European, it may not be surprising that we don't see any cognates to obvious because the bird came before the egg. So the final topic in our exhaustive discussion of eggs, and just for fun, I wanted to bring up a language from far outside the realm of Indo-European, and that's the Thai language, which really only has borrowings from Indo-European thanks to the spread of Buddhism from the monks who spoke Pali, which was a descendant language or a branch of Sanskrit language. So for the Thai language, I want to bring it up for two reasons. Having studied Thai, I tend to agree that the Thai languages are a subclade of the Austronesian languages. And the first reason I wanted to bring up Thai is that I believe it's a real world example of where definitions or meanings rather of the bird word have shifted back and forth between bird and chicken, and that is, I believe, and this isn't my original idea, but I do support the hypothesis that exists out there that manuk is the Proto-Austronesian word for chicken. However, I agree that nok in Thai, which means bird, is its cognate, and I think it went through when Thai became a monosyllabic tonal language as the Thai people passed from Formosa down the Pearl River and then through China, which spoke tonal monosyllabic languages, then down into their present location in Southeast Asia. I think they acquired those properties to their language, and in doing so, had to do some simplification to fit their original words into the paradigm so they could be pronounced with their new, phonological inventory. And what they did was they chopped off if a word like manuk had, or manuk, or how I would pronounce it in Proto-Austronesian, had two syllables, and the first one was unstressed, just go with the second syllable, and you get nook. And you'd replace whatever was missing would affect perhaps what tone it carried in the receiving language of Thai, modern Thai, or early Thai, or wherever this occurred, Proto-Thai, I guess. But somewhere well after Proto-Austronesian. So that manuk went to nok in Thai, but it also underwent a change from the meaning of chicken to the meaning of bird, which may be why it lasted so long in history, why Thai still has a word for bird, which is inherently unstable in terms of a linguistical concept, that lasts so long that it's from a seemingly almost unrelated language family from so many years back, because the recent shift to the meaning of bird may have happened more recently. And the reason it was preserved for so long is because, on the other hand, chicken may be more stable, because chicken is a chicken, unless it supplants the word for bird as it has in Thai. And after which, perhaps in a couple thousand years, the word in the descendant languages of Thai will look nothing like nok for bird. The second reason, so I said there were two reasons I wanted to bring up Thai here, is that this may also be an example of where a language completely on the other side of the world, having nothing to do with Indo-European, the words for egg and bird may be reflexes of a common root. And that is that the word for chicken in Thai is gai, and the word for egg in Thai is kai. And those might be from the same root, and there may not be a coincidence. After all, I mean, gai and kai are as closely sounding and in appearance as are oeo and awi in Proto-Indo-European. So it may not be a one-off that Indo-European had such an interesting potential innovation operator that created a word, either a word for egg from the word from bird, or vice versa, because the exact same thing might have happened in the Thai language, a few thousand years back, between the word for chicken and the word for egg. So I thought that was a nice way to come full circle with this video, or with the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. It may be a long-standing problem in many branches of language, so it seems. Thank you for hanging with me here for this, which was my first episode of my new Citizen Linguist channel. And I mean the term citizen linguist to be like a citizen scientist, because I don't have any formal training other than having studied languages in linguistics itself. I've learned most of what I have through independent study, just because it's something that's really interested me for a long period of time. And I wanted to make this channel to encourage other citizen linguists to explore linguistics, and maybe give them some ideas on what types of things they can research or expand upon. And I welcome any suggestions for topics you'd like me to discuss, and in future episodes. Any comments and corrections, please put them in the comments. Because, like I said, I am an amateur at this. So I haven't formally studied linguistics, although I think I have a pretty good grasp on it, and I do have a history in genetics. So a lot of the parallels you'll see me make in this series are between genetic concepts such as gene mutation rates with the stability of linguistical elements of the linguistic signatures of languages, for example. I see a lot of parallels in something I actually am quite an expert in. So, what do you think? Does egg tell us more about our linguistic ancestors than we thought? Comment below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into historical linguistics, don't forget to like and subscribe and all that. Ring the bell even for more linguistical mysteries.